Welcome to today's Live Science. I'm your host, Judy Stroh. Today, we will be discussing the Doomsday Clock announcement from yesterday. If you saw it, or if you didn't, or if you've read the news, we're just covering it like we always do. With me is who always covers the Doomsday Beat is Mindy Weisberger. But first, we're going to remind you of where we have been with the Doomsday so far.
Today, the members of the Science and Security Board find the world to be no safer than it was last year at this time. And therefore, we have decided to set the Doomsday Clock once again at 100 seconds to midnight. The Doomsday Clock continues to hover dangerously, reminding us how much work is needed to ensure a safer and healthier planet. We must continue to push the hands of the clock away from midnight.
Ooh, hi, Mindy.
Hi, Judy.
It's
me, the voice of doom.
We could always be quoting, "Don't look up, we're all gonna die." So,
yeah. Well, I know just the name, the Doomsday Clock, sounds super dire, and it is.
We are in dire times, but it's funny to think that now we're dire, but this has been going on since 1947.
Yep.
I can't even imagine our dire thoughts back then. So first, for maybe noobs to the Doomsday Clock, can you perhaps go into what the Doomsday Clock is?
Right. So this isn't an actual clock. This is an idea. It's a hypothetical timepiece that measures humanity's nearness to annihilation, and that being the hour of midnight. And so how close the minute hand and second hands come determines how close we are, how safe we are in general, looking at the state of the world. And so this is something that was created in 1947 by the magazine, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And this was in response to the introduction of nuclear weapons to the world stage in World War II. And so this was something that presented an existential threat to humanity that was unlike anything that had existed in human history. And so what the editors of the magazine did was they worked with an artist, Martil Langsdorff, and so she created the design. And initially, when she was asked to create this design for the cover, she at first thought of maybe using the symbol of uranium, but then after conversations with scientists that had actually been part of the Manhattan Project and had worked on the development of the atomic bombs, she saw their concerns and really got a sense of urgency about communicating just how serious a threat this could be. And so that was how she came up with the idea of a clock and hands that are close to midnight.
I see. So yeah, this design hasn't changed too much over the years, but now it is a little different, right?
Right. Yeah, it was actually so her design was done in 1947, and then it was reimagined by another graphic designer in 2007.
Right. Cool. What else are we doing right now?
Well, as far as the time, so the time was just reset, as you know, and as as you all saw in the video, it stands at right now at 100 seconds to midnight, and it's been at this time since that time was actually set in 2020. It stayed there in 2021, and now again in 2022. This is the closest that the clock has ever been to midnight in its entire 75-year history, and this is for a number of factors. Obviously, when the clock was first introduced, the threat of nuclear weapons was enormous, and it was almost inconceivable at the time that there could be anything else that could possibly match that as an existential threat. fast forward to 2020 and 2021 and 2022, and right now we are seeing the effects of accelerating climate change. We're seeing the effect of global pandemics, and so there are factors that, in addition to the ongoing and continued threat of nuclear weapons, which are still being in some countries are still being produced, are still being stockpiled. We still have vast stockpiles of these weapons, thousands of them, in fact, in the U.S. and in Russia, and hundreds more in other countries as well. So that threat hasn't gone away, but now it's compounded by the additional threats of climate change, which, as we're seeing the evidence of how it's accelerating and how it's changing the planet and creating just more hazards for life on Earth, and the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are now entering our third year.
We're doing it live. We are literally living these fun times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny to think that just there's this group of people that are sitting around like solving our problems without actually being a part of the solutions. But it obviously informs the general science community, hopefully at large, or vice versa, I suppose.
Right. Well, that's the idea. I mean, calling it the Doomsday Clock. It's very striking. It's very it's this very strong visual and also a visual reminder, but also an idea that hopefully the idea is that this is something that should make people take a step back and go, okay, why are we just living with these threats that could that are potentially life-ending, life-threatening, planet-ending? We should do something about this. And so that's the idea. When the bulletin resets the clock every year, they take a look at the events of the past year, and they say, okay, are we any safer now than we were a year ago? Are we any safer today than in the past 75 years that the clock has been keeping time? So initially it was just one person who was setting the time of the clock. It was the editor of the Bulletin, the Atomic Scientist, until the early 1970s. But now the time is set by a group of people that are part of the Science and Security Board for the Bulletin. And so these are scientists and policy advisors, and they consult with their colleagues. They consult with the board of sponsors for the Bulletin, which includes 13 Nobel laureates. Nobel laureates. They're Nobel too, but Nobel. And so the idea is looking at what is the state of nuclear stockpiling in the world? What is the state of climate change? What is the state of disruptive technologies? And so these are all factors that are considered as they evaluate how safe we are, and based on that, what should the time of the clock be moving forward into the next year?
Yeah, we have this nice quote here, right, from this year.
Right. So where we are right now, 100 seconds to midnight, the Bulletin, when they released a statement of the new clock's time, they basically said, we're on the doorstep of doom, and so it's no place to loiter. This we've lingered on this doorstep. It's since the clock was set at 100 seconds to midnight in 2020, and we need to start moving it back. But moving it back actually involves taking more action than we collectively globally have in the past 2 years.
Yeah. Cool. So should we show your interview with Suzet?
Well, right. Well, like as we were just talking about some of the things that they looked at, that the Bulletin experts looked at to fix the new time. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is still very much in the forefront for everyone. But one of the things they looked at is how have governments responded to this? What has been done to prevent the spread of the disease? And what we've been seeing over the past year is quite honestly has been a failure at many levels for consistent for access to vaccines, messaging about and enforcing things like vaccinations and masking and social distancing, all of which are proven to slow the transmission of infectious disease. And so obviously the role, the importance of COVID-19 was something that was looked at very closely. And so to that end, I spoke to one of the experts who sets the time for the Doomsday Clock for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and that is Dr. Suzet McKinney, who is a member of the Science and Security Board for the Bulletin and is also the principal and director of life sciences at Sterling Bay in Chicago.
She seems great. Looking forward to watching. All right, here we go.
Dr. McKinney, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, so when the clock was first introduced in 1947, it was just after the end of World War II, when the world had just witnessed the destructive power of nuclear weapons, which were considered the biggest existential threat to our future as a species. When did pandemics and public health become a factor for the scientists who set the time of the clock every year?
Well, I think that several years ago, the Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists began to recognize and really embrace the fact that in addition to climate change and nuclear threats, that the growing biological threat was an issue and would likely continue to be an issue. So they started to build some expertise on the Science and Security Board, and that was actually how I came to be a member of the Science and Security Board. So I've been on the board now for, probably 7 or 8 years, I think it's been.
Wow.
It's sobering to think about how long I've been involved. But, I think with the onset of COVID-19 in 2020, it was something we watched very closely last year. We had some serious discussions about it last year as we were proceeding toward setting the time on the clock. But I have to be honest with you, this year working on setting the time of the clock, we really had to even more so recognize and embrace not just what was right in front of us in terms of biological threats with COVID-19, but what we can potentially see coming, the ever growing threat of biological hazards.
Okay, so when setting the Doomsday Clock, how do experts such as yourself evaluate pandemics and pandemic responses worldwide and the threat of potential future pandemics? So what are you looking for to determine if governments are getting it right, if things are moving in the right direction, or if there's a situation that's creating greater risk?
Yeah, so we look at what's happening currently and how well governments are responding to what's happening currently. We look at what has impacted the government's ability to either respond appropriately or not, as we've seen in several situations with COVID. But then we also look at what's emerging in the field, both from a naturally occurring perspective, as well as from a technology perspective. And we deliberate around the magnitudes of those emerging threats and look at possibilities for what can happen if man-made threats are pursued, if natural threats are able to evolve without any type of intervention significant enough to sort of reverse the threat, if you will. And we spend a considerable amount of time in discussion, deliberating over the magnitude of these threats and what we think they can do to civilization should they come to fruition in very real ways. And obviously we do that not only for biological threats, but also for climate change issues and nuclear threats as well. It is a very time-intensive process, and it's something obviously that we take very seriously.
Yeah, now obviously the threat of global pandemics, this is not a new challenge, and particularly zoonotic diseases, diseases that can jump between species, that can originate in animals. This is something that scientists and researchers have been aware of for some time now, but actually dealing with it on the ground, the COVID-19 pandemic, that's put governments and communities worldwide in a completely different place. And when the clock was updated in 2021, Rachel Bronson at the time, who was the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, she'd said that over the course of 2020, as the pandemic was spreading, she said specifically that governments around the world abdicated their responsibility, did not cooperate, and consequently failed to protect the health and welfare of their citizens. So how would you say, what's different now? What has changed or hasn't changed over the past year?
I think certainly what we've seen here in the US and even in, other places around the world is that, COVID, number one, has not gone away. And so I think Rachel was absolutely right with what she said last year, and the abdication of responsibility has proven itself not to be a valuable tool or valuable strategy, if you will, for managing this global pandemic. And, I think we've seen governments around the world recognize the true impact of their failure to respond appropriately. Millions, hundreds of millions of cases, and the millions of deaths that we've seen as a result of this pandemic. And so, now, at least here in the US, our change in administration, I believe the new administration is trying to turn the tide, but there was so much damage done in our initial response that I think it's proven very difficult to turn the tide of the course with this pandemic. I think, as you said, we've known, scientists and researchers and even, governmental public health officials have known about the threat of pandemics for years. And we did significant preparation in response to those pandemics. But what I really believe is that first and foremost, at the highest levels of government, especially where funding decisions are made and decisions are made about how to allocate federal dollars to respond to these types of threats, I don't believe that at the highest levels of government, people really thought that something like this would happen. I think drill down to local levels of government and state levels of government, we knew full well of the possibility, but I think the difference is we also recognized and understood the danger in how levels of preparedness can be lost and diminished when funding cuts take place and you're unable to maintain the capacity to manage a pandemic at the local and state levels. I think at the highest levels of government, the federal levels, there is this sort of perception that, nothing's happening, no one is affected. So when we're looking for places to cut funding, that's a good place to start because, they're okay. I really believe that that's where the initial sort of abdication of responsibility started. Mm-hmm. And then once the global pandemic was right in front of us, then I think it helps people understand why we were caught so off guard. It wasn't that planning had not been done. Tons of planning, tons of preparation had been done, but you can't maintain capacity when you're dealing with continuous funding cuts.
Yeah, no, of course. So looking at the concrete things that can be done and the aspects of the planning that can be done beforehand to set things up so that we don't have the worst possible outcome. What would be considered a best case scenario for an organized pandemic response? What are all the boxes that need to be or should be ticked to bring a pandemic like COVID-19 under control on a global scale?
Sure. There are many boxes that can be checked, but among them would include what I like to call whole of community planning. And that is where, planning is not just done in individual disciplinary silos, but instead you have government working in collaboration with the healthcare sector, with the private business community, so that where resources and capabilities that exist in the private sector can be brought to bear in a governmental response, that those plans and procedures are identified and outlined ahead of time. I think also having mechanisms in place to work collaboratively with communities, community leaders and other community stakeholders, because when something like this is, front and center at hand, government cannot be everywhere at once, and government cannot be all things to all people. But there is a level of empowerment and work that can be done ahead of time with community stakeholders to help communities better know where to go for resources, where to go for critical information that will be needed during the time of response, and also that will equip them with things that they can do themselves within their own communities to build some protection around those communities, to give the government time to be able to respond. Obviously, having relationships and pathways to communicate effectively, keyword, with the media is also very important to have laid out ahead of time, because I think that media, both print and television and other forms of media, social media included, are critical in terms of helping people understand what's going on, what the government's doing, and also what they can be doing. But if media personnel don't have the pathways already established for where they can go to get information if they're going to be reporting, I think that creates the opportunity for things to just, get a little bit unwieldy and difficult to manage. I think having effective procedures in place for augmenting the healthcare system is also critical. Whether that augmentation is from an information perspective, a reporting perspective, or even a provision of goods, supplies, and resources to the healthcare sector, that's going to be critical. Having, I can't think of the word I want to use, but some general policies around how laboratory procedures and personal protective equipment and just basic care procedures around infectious diseases, highly infectious pathogens, already defined and laid out as much as possible with healthcare partners is another bucket or box that can be ticked off. And then also just having a very sound operational methodology for how medical countermeasures are going to be provided to the general public. Things like vaccines, or if an antiviral medication is available, how do you provide those resources in mass scale to your general population? So those are just some of the few boxes that I think, I prefaced by saying there are many. And that's not to say that those things are easy to do. They're not, but those are the types of things that, if you can have those things sort of even generally defined in advance of something happening, then what's happening at the moment and how events are unfolding will inform more of the specifics. But in my practice and in my work, I have always said that the emergency is not the time to be passing out your business cards. And what I mean by that is these relationships have to be developed, meetings and just collaborative work has to be taking place well in advance so that, you aren't caught off guard when something happens. Because in the moment, it becomes about preservation of life.
Of course. Yeah. And as you mentioned, yes, there are many boxes to be ticked. And obviously the best time to do many of these is in preparation for a pandemic rather than while we're already in one. But from where we are standing right now, in the place that the world is right now, what would you say are the biggest challenges to overcome, and what are the things that require the most immediate attention to change our course?
Yeah, I think right now, by far the biggest challenge is work that's being done to try and convince our public to take this pandemic seriously and to take what we know, what is proven by science to be the proper precautionary measures. And that is first and foremost vaccination. For those of us who have been vaccinated, it is getting boosted. And then moving beyond that, just continuing to be diligent with masking and physical distancing. Those are really the things that are going to change the course for us. For people that I come into contact with who are unfamiliar with how the science is unfolding and how public health works, one of the things that I say is, first and foremost, none of us should be happy about the fact that the mitigation measures that we're using for COVID-19, masking, physical distancing, cancellation of large public events, are the exact same mitigation measures that were used in 1918 for that global pandemic. That's number one.
Mm-hmm.
None of us should be happy about that. The other thing that I say is, as long as we have large segments of the population who are averse to vaccination for whatever reason, that means that the virus continues to live. As long as the virus has the ability to continue living, it has the opportunity to mutate. And that's why we keep seeing all the variants. So vaccination is critical. And then I think also just our scientists and researchers having the opportunity to continue to study this virus and its multiple mutations, to learn as much as we can about the behavior of this virus, so that, because it's that research and those results that will inform how we continue to respond, but it will also inform potentially how we respond to future pandemics. So I think those are the two most critical components at this point in time.
Mm-hmm. All right, I have one last question for you. And you already touched on this a little bit, but this is for our viewers who are, watching the clock update, wondering what they can do on an individual level. What would you tell them?
I would tell them, once the announcement of the time on the clock comes out, we also issue a statement from the board about the time and why the time was set. I think it's very important for people to read that statement and pull the things out of that statement that they can charge their elected officials with paying attention to and acting upon. Your state legislators, your state senators, your Congress members, and federal senators. And because there are things that our government can be doing to better prepare us for these types of pandemics and other threats in the future. But that action seems to be more readily accepted when we put pressure on our elected officials and when we let them know what we care about as individual citizens. So that would be what I would say people should do once we have the announcement of the clock released.
Right. As much as it's called the Doomsday Clock, doomsday is not the inevitable outcome here.
Exactly. And it's not what we want, but the things that we place in our statement are designed to objectively give people the truth as we see it, as a group of scientists and experts in the various fields that we cover and that we are concerned about. And our goal is to equip everyday citizens with that knowledge and that information, which they can use not only to be informed themselves, but as I said, to inform their elected leaders and get our governments to act.
Okay. I have been talking to Dr. Suzet McKinney about pandemics, COVID-19, and the Doomsday Clock. You can find out more about the 75th anniversary of the clock and its new time for 2022 in my article over at Live Science. Dr. McKinney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Wow, Mindy.
A lot of food for thought. Yeah.
She is amazing. I mean, what a get, like somebody from the actual committees that are used to contemplate this time and all that. I mean,
yeah, it was really interesting to get her perspective on, not only what are the considerations when making these decisions about what time to set the clock, but also thinking ahead and looking at, okay, well, this is where we're at right now. What are the steps that we take to get to a better place?
Yeah, we've been having some commenting on Facebook and YouTube during this, and somebody commented this earlier. Thanks, James. Every clock is right 2 times a day, but this, luckily isn't a real clock, and it is hopefully I mean, hopefully it's not right. Hopefully we have a
Well,
little
it can be right for now. That doesn't mean that it's not going to change. The clock, the clock has moved back and forth over the last 75 years. It has been as far as 17 minutes from midnight when the U.S. and the Soviet Union signed a treaty to reduce nuclear weapons in 1991, I think, and. Yeah, so it is possible, and as you can see from the graph, there are peaks and there are valleys, and the high points on this graph are when we're safer. That's those mark when the clock was farthest from midnight. But yeah, there have also been times where it has been closer. Before 2020, it went to 2 minutes to midnight in 1953 when the U.S. and the Soviet Union exploded the first hydrogen bomb. So. Again, it's a lot depends on what are the threats we're facing and how are the leaders, the world leaders, and the nations of the world responding.
Yeah, and it's interesting to be able to see like people outside the science community, like what their feelings are in this, because we're just watching it. I would say also I'm outside of the science community, but we're just watching with everybody else, wondering like what the great leaders say. We have a comment from YouTube from Blind Sow. Despite our unique ability among species to foresee and prepare for distant threats, we seem to have remarkable distaste for doing so. I feel like that is definitely on the nose for the reasons of our clock getting closer and closer to impending doom. Then again, we also have this idea from Facebook: unless we have divine intervention or aid from ETs out there, the end is nigh.
Well, I wouldn't quite go that far. These are all of the issues that we're talking about, all of the problems here. These are all human created problems, and they can be solved by humans too. So it's not a matter of waiting for some kind of Deus Ex Machina to come down and save us. It's on us to save ourselves.
Yes, humans are a human created problem, that's for sure. Poor Earth, poor Earth. Cool. Well, I feel like we should move on to your next wonderful interview.
Right. Well, you're bringing in comments from YouTube, and of course, one of the other factors that the experts with the bulletins board consider is looking at new technologies, disruptive technologies, and the past year certainly is certainly in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also to climate change. The role of the internet, the rapid spread of disinformation, certainly have play a very, very big part in terms of spreading wrong ideas, in terms of getting in the way of people accepting the science, of people understanding the science, of people having conversations about the science that are not heavily polarized. And so for this, the 75th anniversary of the clock, the board reached out to someone for whom the internet is an area of particular expertise, and that is of course the science communicator Hank Green. And so yes, I spoke to him about this as well.
Cool, let's check it out.
Here, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists had a special guest on hand for their update of the Doomsday Clock. You may know him from the science programs SciShow and Crash Course, or from his long-running YouTube channel, Vlogbrothers. Science communicator, video creator, and author, Hank Green. Hank, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to talk.
2021 has been a year.
Yeah.
So
several, you might even feel.
Really, like what even is time anymore?
Yeah.
And even with the rollouts of the vaccines for COVID-19, we're still deep in the pandemic for a number of reasons. There's a new highly infectious variant, unequal access to vaccines, and other preventative care. And there's also been a lot of pushback to masking, vaccination, and lockdowns, even though these have been scientifically proven to prevent the spread of disease. So as a science communicator, what can science communicators do when misinformation and politicizing spreads online and leads people to reject science, even at the cost of their own health?
I think one of the things that we can do is recognize that we are in a unique situation in a lot of ways. And one of them is a complete revolution in how humans communicate that has no parallel in time. Like if it has any parallel, it is the invention of the printing press, which was a pretty tumultuous moment in human history and resulted in a lot of upheavals to power structures that were both good and not good, just like we are experiencing now. And so the fact that this is hard, we should accept that like it is hard for a very good reason, and that it is not just that like people are bad. People are worse when we are given extraordinarily powerful tools that we have no systems to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Communication is like the most fundamental thing that we do. And I think that it is very hard to keep up with all of that. So my strategy has been a little bit focus on the problems that I see, get to know them really well, and stay focused on that. And I have felt much more comfortable in my life and communication since I've sort of been like, I need to pick a lane and like not be all over the place all of the time. And then the other thing is that I try to maintain a sense of empathy, which is extremely difficult. Both because of the structure of the internet, making it more difficult because we don't have like a human face that we're looking at. And we don't have like all of those cues to tell us that that like we should treat people like people, but also because like we aren't being treated like people for the same reasons. And so it's very difficult not to escalate and to be the one who takes things down a notch instead of pushes it up again and then again and again. And that what this project, what the atomic clock represents, is a recognition that like the most important thing to preserve is humanity. Like this marvelous experiment where a bunch of like where like a planet had water and energy and carbon and then suddenly woke up and looked at itself. Like that's
right. No, but at the same time, I mean, as much as like something like the Doomsday Clock addresses, the bigger picture of humanity's excuse me, of humanity's future, but at the same time, it seems like we're undergoing growing pains at so many stages of our development as a species, in terms of coming up against these new technologies that we are driving, and we're driving them. Sometimes it seems like beyond our own ability to manage them healthily or effectively.
I mean, yes, way beyond.
Yeah,
sometimes I hear people saying like how advanced the algorithms that are controlling the internet are right now, and I'm like, they are babies. They are dumb little babies that know nothing and that are gonna look like dumb little like 6 months olds in like 2 years. Like we are so at the very beginning of this, and the very beginning is, and that's not to say that we're at the very beginning of the hard part, but we are at the very beginning of this transformation.
Right. It also sometimes seems like there are different kinds of hard parts. Like when the Bulletin first set up the Doomsday Clock 75 years ago, the big existential threat was nuclear weapons, and nobody at the time could conceive of something that could be a bigger threat to humanity than that. And now here we are.
Well, I guess you're right.
There are some things that are arguably a little more immediate than that. We've got accelerating climate change. We've got a global pandemic that we're still getting under control.
Yeah. I mean, like nuclear weapons are still.
Look, I'm not saying they've gone away.
Yeah, they certainly haven't gone away. Yep. And the thing about nuclear weapons is that like a biological weapon, which it would be much more dangerous than a naturally evolved virus, probably. A biological weapon would kill the bejesus out of humanity, but like it would leave the rest. Whereas nuclear weapons would be like, all right, well, reboot. Like we're taking the whole planet. A lot of evolution again. Yeah, it's just gonna be real slow. Yeah, not that it like equally bad for me, equally bad for all of the things that I love the most. But at least the Eagles would probably be okay.
So just to step back a little bit from the dire big picture stuff. One of the things about science communication that is just that is certainly a great joy for me, and I know is for a lot of people who do this, is learning about new discoveries, like calling out and just describing and all of the like weird stuff about our world, and just sharing it with as many people as possible. So where's the place for that? Where's the place for stories like that? And is there still a place for that in a world where there are also these sort of these larger dire situations like climate change and pandemics that are just
Sure.
demanding our constant attention. The smaller, weirder, like, wow, nature is wonderful, or nature is bizarre, or nature is creepy, or nature is just, like, I don't know what's going on here.
There's never been a time in human history, I don't think, when people weren't making jokes. There's never been joyless moments for all humans. Like, there are certainly joyless moments for individual humans.
Yeah, right.
If we end up in a situation where the US, where I live and you live, like, goes in a deeply disturbing direction from the perspective of the two of us, we will still have joyful moments. We will, and like, that's the thing that, like, it's, you look back at history, you can't see that because you have to tell a fairly simple story. But like, there will still be wonder and laughter and art, and so yeah, like, there's always room for that. And like, I also think that, like, you can't just be dire. Like, nobody wants to. I mean, this is the sort of like conundrum presented in Don't Look Up, this new Netflix movie.
Right.
That the morning show doesn't really want to have you on if you're going to tell us that we're all going to die.
Yeah.
It's like, whether or not that's true, like, whether or not we are all going to die, it is still true that they don't want you on.
No, that makes you shouty and unpleasant.
Yeah. And this is a huge difficulty with climate change, which is a really big, scary challenge. We don't really know what it's going to look like, but we know it's going to be bad. We know it's going to be experienced unequally, but we also know that no one is going to be not affected by it, very much like a pandemic. And almost like that's always the case. Like, big problems are experienced unequally, but that doesn't mean it doesn't affect everyone. And like, I had this problem. I got a master's degree in environmental studies, and it was 2 years of bad news. And my reaction to that was different from a lot of my fellow students, which was to like be like, okay, how are we trying to fix these problems in like big systemic ways? Like, what is because like a lot of folks were like, how do we get to a world where there are no cars? And I'm just like, I don't know, an apocalypse. Like I don't think people are going to make that decision. Have you met Americans? I don't think that we're going to be like, I figured it out. We should be like the Netherlands. Like, there's too much space between us. Like, we've already built the infrastructure. Yep. We're stuck. So what is it? And this was the early 2000s. Like, how do we get to a world where electric cars are normal? And we are finally 20 years later getting to a place where electric cars are normal. And I think that, like, within the next 10 years, that will be the majority of cars being sold. That was too slow, but it's the arrow's pointing in the right direction. Mm-hmm. And it's the same way with renewable energy. I don't think that the US will ever build a coal-fired power plant again. And I don't, like, that wasn't 20 years ago. I would never have guessed that we would have gotten to a place where I could be talking to you right now and say, like, the US will never build a coal plant again. And like, we're going to close them down like every year from now until there's none. So that's just great news. It's not fast enough. It's still like, we're still going to experience tremendous negative consequences, but I'm an optimistic person who is aware of dramatically difficult problems. I feed on good news. I feed on joy and wonder and curiosity. And I don't think that, like, we solve any problems without those things.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, especially people that aren't, maybe aren't studying what the way forward is going to be, that are maybe just, tuning in to see what the Doomsday Clock update is going to be, because just the name Doomsday Clock sounds like something that needs their attention. So yeah. So being able to go from, oh my God, here's this announcement about the Doomsday Clock. Obviously, I know we're in a pandemic. I know that climate change is happening, and I know it's accelerating. But is there anything at all that I can do about it, or is doomsday inevitable? And are we just heading down the down the hill towards annihilation? There's nothing we can do to stop it. What do you tell people to get them past that point of, I acknowledge that there's a possibility of doomsday, but not doomsday is inevitable and there's nothing I can do?
I think so first of all, the Doomsday Clock would be at midnight if doomsday were inevitable. So it's not, like, that's the whole point. But and I think that the internet sometimes asks us to be aware of and focusing on every problem equally as an individual. I think that there are lots of problems that we should be aware of and focusing on equally as a society, but like individuals can't be that way. And so if you think to yourself, I need to be doing like racial justice and climate change and fighting, anti-democracy stuff, and I need to be worried about like the multilateral arms control agreements, like you will die. That's not like burnout. That's like you turned into cinders and you are now ashes on the floor. So if you can get curious about one problem and make it a little bit like marginally easier to solve or a little bit better, other people will be working on other problems, and together you just have to, sometimes like people say, oh, that problem took care of itself, like in a kind of way where like, and the reality is that like that problem got taken care of by other people. They just weren't you. And you don't understand how they did it. And you don't need to, because you're taking care of the problems that you know about, that you're more of an expert on. And like, for me, like that might be like, how do we communicate better on the internet? Because that's sort of like my area of expertise, but like, it's going to be different for everybody. And that's the big thing, is like, we can't put it all on ourselves to fix everything. I think that this is particularly a problem with young people. I know I felt this way. But like, just because the action that you have doesn't fix everything doesn't mean that it's not part of fixing everything.
Yeah, I have to say though, at least the attention that Don't Look Up has been getting, and the fact that there have been so many conversations about it, and the fact that people are recognizing that this is a metaphor for something that we are living through right now, that seems like that might be, like maybe cause for some optimism, that people are paying attention in a way that maybe they weren't in the last few years.
And as a juxtaposition to that movie, which of course is, intentionally simplifies the reality that we are living in. Sure. These are hard problems. It's not like if everybody agreed that climate change was a problem, it'd just get fixed next week. Like, it is expensive. It is like, we are really reliant on fossil fuel infrastructure. We like the average car in America should last for 10, 20 years. Like, we shouldn't be building cars that don't last that long. So like, every gasoline car that we sell this year is going to be on the road in 15 years. And that's how it should be, but also it's a big problem because it's going to be burning gas that whole time. So don't ever buy a new gasoline burning car ever. If you're listening to this, go get a used Volt before you can afford the used full electric or something. Like, don't do it. Get a car that plugs into a wall now, however you can, or keep driving your current internal combustion car until it just explodes.
Some of it is people just accepting that there are decisions that we make that affect us right now, but there are also decisions we make now that have very far-reaching impacts.
So my point is, it's so hard. It's a very hard problem. There are lots of stakeholders. They have and like countries agreeing to limit their own economic growth together. Like, it's really like, nation states were the best bad idea. Like, we had to have them, but like it causes big problems because we all sort of imagine us in competition with each other. So it's hard, and presenting it as something that we could just take care of, if only everyone would agree with me, I think it's just the height of hubris, and also it's just sort of like a dicky way to be. So I think that it's going to be hard. It's going to require a lot of people working together really hard.
Hank, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Of course. Thank you.
I'm a little more hopeful now, Judy.
Sorry, can you say that?
Are you feeling just a little more hopeful now?
Oh my gosh, yes. I actually, while we're watching that, I mean, I know I edited it, but like, there's a comment that he said, oh my God, how am I doing this? Just because the action that you have doesn't fix everything doesn't mean it's not part of fixing everything. Like, I want to get that tattooed. I mean, what Wonderful. And I also shouldn't be surprised. Hank is wonderful. That was such great advice, just great insight. I mean, just the idea of like focusing, like staying in your lane, or not one lane, just like a lane that you feel comfortable.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these big issues, especially since, big systemic change is something that it requires organized effort, and it is not something that happens on an individual level, but individuals can play a part in making these big changes happen. And I think that's the message, that's the takeaway. And ultimately, that's what the Doomsday Clock is about. It's not supposed to make you feel hopeless. It's supposed to make you feel hopeful about a future that is a little bit safer than the one we're in right now.
It's all perspective, right? I mean, everything can be that two sides of the coins. But, like he said, we never thought of a world where electric cars could even be the norm. It is like hearing that is like, right, we have come a long way. We really have done better,
Right.
guys. We are working together. It really does take a village to raise a planet, It's
yeah. Well, I hope for everyone who was watching that was, that maybe we're ending on a slightly more hopeful note than we started. If for those of you who are watching, if you want to know more, you can read the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist's statement about the 2022 clock time. They include a list of practical steps for moving us away from catastrophe, and you can find that at thebulletin.org /doomsday clock /current time. The Bulletin is also asking people for your thoughts, your ideas, your personal actions for turning back the hands of the Doomsday Clock. And you can share those on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, using the hashtag #TurnBackTheClock. And and you can read more about the Doomsday Clock at Live Science.
Yeah, I did want to do a little plug for their website because it has this really neat tool. You can like scroll through the bar. Let me just show you real quick and see like how it's changed, and why perhaps over the years it's just a really cool tool. Obviously, we're not going to sit here and go over it all, but
yeah, but if you're interested in stepping through all of the years, seeing what all of the times have been, seeing how we got to the point we're at now, and seeing how the clock it moves forward, it moves back, and so even from where we are now, moving it back is still a possibility and is still within reach.
Here's hoping, Mindy. All right, well, I guess we're gonna have to do this again next year and cut back to our all of our hope from next year.
We'll see how we do.
All right, well, thanks again, Mindy. Great job with these interviews, and see you next time.